Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 160, King John, New Made Honour Doth Forget Men's Names. Last time, before that little return trip to the Italian Renaissance and the Commedia dell'arte, I took you through Richard II, Shakespeare's heavily political verse play that remains one of his most popular offerings. Now it's on to one of the less popular history plays, one that has, with few exceptions, been least performed throughout the centuries. That lack of popularity is for several reasons, which I will discuss, but it is still a play of considerable interest as part of the canon, and has some moments and characterizations that are very worthy of note. But first, a brief synopsis of the characters and the plot. The play opens as King John and his mother, Queen Eleanor, are meeting the French ambassador. Through him, Philip, the King of France, is sending word that he is supporting the claims of John's nephew, Prince Arthur, to the English crown. When John rejects the proposal, war is declared between France and England. As the French ambassadorial party leave court, the Falconbridge brothers arrive to seek the king's assistance in settling an inheritance dispute. Philip is the older brother, but illegitimate. As they discuss the matter, Eleanor suggests that Philip is the son of John's brother, the dead King Richard, the Lionheart. In the light of an offer to join the king, receive a knighthood and a change of name to Sir Richard, Philip agrees and forgoes his Falconbridge inheritance. When he tells his mother of his elevation, she berates him for impugning her honour, but in private she admits that King Richard was his father. In France, King Philip begins the fight for Arthur's claim by besieging the English possession of Angers. John arrives with the English army with a counterclaim to the French throne. Eleanor argues with Arthur's mother, Constance, about those respective claims. As tensions between the two sides build, the town spokesman, Hubert, is asked to judge the claims. He says that the town will support whoever wins the battle. The armies meet off-stage, but the outcome is inconclusive, with both sides claiming victory, but clearly there is only stalemate. The new Sir Richard, mostly still referred to as Philip the Bastard, suggests that the French unite with the English, and that they should jointly sack the town as a punishment for the indecision of the townspeople. Hubert counter-proposes a dynastic marriage between John's niece Blanche and the French king's son Louis. When John offers 5 of his French possessions as a generous dowry for Blanche, the king agrees to the match. Arthur is given a royal title to pacify his mother, but she still feels betrayed. As the royal parties leave for the wedding, Philip the Bastard comments on John's capitulation as an unsatisfactory outcome, and swears to pursue riches for himself while in the service of the king. Constance continues to argue against the new alliance in an ever more distracted state until Cardinal Pandolf, a papal emissary, arrives and demands that before the marriage can be sanctioned, John must acknowledge the Pope's choice of Archbishop of Canterbury, a long-running dispute between the papacy and King John. John refuses and denies that the Pope has any jurisdiction in English lands. Pandolf excommunicates John, and Philip reluctantly agrees with Pandolf to fight John to remove him from power. During the ensuing battle, Arthur is captured by John, who sends him to England in the care of Hubert, now a close ally of the king. But he tells Hubert that Arthur is a threat to his crown and that he must die. Hubert agrees that he can complete that task. The French mourn the losses they have suffered on the battlefield as Eleanor and the bastard continue to fight. Constance descends into grief, and the cardinal persuades Louis of his claim to England through his marriage to Blanche. They agree that now is the time to invade England, as the country appears to be descending into chaos. Hubert prepares to maim and then kill Arthur, but in the moment he can't bring himself to do it, and resolves to hide the boy instead. The English nobles plead with John for the release of Arthur. A messenger arrives to deliver the news that Eleanor has died and that Constance is also dead, consumed by grief and madness. The bastard arrives to report that he has successfully raised support for King in the country. Hubert tells the king that Arthur is dead, which causes the nobles to leave and join Louis. As the king unfairly castigates Hubert, he confesses that he did not in fact kill Arthur, but unbeknown to him, Arthur has committed suicide by jumping from the castle walls, where the nobles, and later Hubert, discover his body. More lords join Louis in his cause to overthrow John. As the French army closes in on London, John agrees to recognise papal authority, but the cardinal cannot persuade Louis to stop his advance. John is struck down with illness and retires to an abbey. During the battle, a dying French knight tells the lords of England that Louis plans to kill them all once the day is won, and they rush back to John's defence. As word gets out that the king may have been poisoned, the nobles come to the abbey with Henry, John's son, to witness his death. Philip the Bastard has continued to fight the French, and they finally agree to follow the cardinal's advice to leave England. As Henry takes John's body for burial, Philip the Bastard declares that there will now be peace throughout the land. Although some points of the play correspond closely to the account of John's reign in Holingshed's Chronicles, the play is most likely primarily sourced from an earlier anonymous play, The Troublesome Reign of John, King of England, which was also based on Holingshed. That play is dated to 1598, with Shakespeare's version being dated to the mid-1590s. The play was not published until its inclusion in the first folio, which is thought to be based on a 1596 manuscript that was recopied in 1609, and pinning the play to a more precise dating is difficult. It is again Francis Mears who first mentions the play in his 1598 list, attributing it to Shakespeare. That earlier play was confidently attributed to Shakespeare himself by some scholars, but there was and is significant disagreement about this, and what consensus there is centres around George Peele being the earlier author, possibly in collaboration with the likes of Robert Greene, Thomas Lodge, or even Christopher Marlowe. This earlier play was published first in 1591 in a two-part quarto edition, and then again in 1611 in a single volume. Both of those editions did not credit an author, but the third quarto that was printed in 1622 presented it as the work of W.S.H. Rather than being conclusive proof of Shakespeare's authorship, this is generally assumed to be a marketing strategy on the part of the bookseller. There was another earlier play retelling the King John story. This one is called The Death of King John, and again it's of anonymous composition, and also sometimes attributed to Peele. This play is more anti-Catholic in its tone than the other earlier play and Shakespeare's version. Shakespeare's King John, like Richard II, is a verse play, but not so compelling in either its verse or its characterizations. This, and the problematic dating of both plays, has led to suggestions that King John was composed before Richard II and was a piece where Shakespeare learnt more about the craft of writing a verse play, acquired skills that he then put to better use in Richard II. Although there are scenes, verse and characters of some achievement, there are also scenes, verse and characters that are less than successful. So much so that the play has a rather uneven quality. Almost all of the main characters can be seen as problematic in some way, and the whole thrust of the narrative lacks the drive of the other history plays. It has often been compared to the plays in the Henriade, in particular in an unfavourable way, and it's difficult to disagree with that. But I hope you will agree by the end of this episode that although King John is not an entirely successful play, it does get a good mark for effort. Some critics suggest that an explanation for the unevenness of the play is that it was a hurried rewrite of one of the earlier plays. As the company playwright, Shakespeare would quite possibly have been writing to order and at speed, especially in those early years. But whether we see this play as shoddy work, or a hurried copy to order, or a learning exercise showing promise for the future, depends on our view of Shakespeare and by how much we feel we have to excuse his less than exemplary work. We don't know how well received or not the play was in its own time, but we can speculate that perhaps this was where Shakespeare realised that writing verse plays based on English history was not successful unless the story could be told through individual characters, rather than just relying more or less on the broader events of history, as this seems to be a change he made from Richard II onwards, and which made the later verse plays much more successful as pieces of theatre. As far as historical accuracy is concerned, Shakespeare played things more fast and loose than he did in Richard II. The young Arthur's claim to the throne was nowhere near as solid, and therefore not so much of a threat to John as Shakespeare makes out. Richard named John his successor in his will, which was supported by the English nobility. So there's really not much to argue about there. It was only by enacting unpopular policies that John lost the support of the barons. Arthur was older than he is shown in the play, at least 16, and his final fate is unknown. He vanished in 1203, about a year after he was captured by the English and held at Rouen. Leopold of Austria, killer of Richard I in the play, had died 5 years before John became king, and he is in fact a composite of several historical figures associated with Richard's defeat and death. Constance had remarried and then died a year before Arthur was captured, and Falconbridge, Philip the Bastard, is a creation of Shakespeare's imagination, invented to be a moral foil to John, but not based on any particular historical person. The timeline of events is compressed to accommodate the action. The Pope's quarrel with England was a long-standing one, and the issue over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury was not fully resolved until 1207. And Pandulf's plotting with the French didn't start until 1211, the same year that the French planned to invade England. John did die that year, but of dysentery while on campaign against some rebellious earls, rather than poison, by which time he had fought 4 wars with Philip of France, not just the 2 shown in the play. Although all of this seems quite forgivable for dramatic purposes and the limitations of the stage, it does make the major events of the play seem more interdependent than they actually were. Perhaps one of the most interesting things about Shakespeare's version of John is that he avoided showing him as motivated only by anti-Catholic sentiments. Now that would have gone down very well with his audience, just as it presumably did with the earlier versions of the story told in the playhouse. But perhaps he was more interested in drawing parallels with Elizabeth to put her in a favourable light. Elizabeth, like John, was excommunicated by the Pope and not recognised as the legitimate ruler of England by the papacy. The big difference between Elizabeth and the John shown in the play is that she succeeded in holding the country together in the face of invasion and did not have to resort to the sort of dubious tactics and alliances that John did, or to suborning herself to the Pope. Of course, the decision to reduce the anti-Catholic rhetoric of his sources may also have been made for personal reasons. There is plenty of conjecture about how much Catholic sympathy Shakespeare and his family held, and if he was indeed a sympathetic or closet Catholic himself. If he was, then presumably his natural inclination would be to keep criticism of the Church to a minimum, although of course he couldn't exclude it completely. One of the main criticisms of the play, particularly from earlier critics, is that the role of King John himself is unclear. Some have found a titular role that is neither a hero nor an anti-hero difficult to take. Some of the modern critics, perhaps more used to ambivalence in leading characters, have been more forgiving. Seeing the play as lacking any sort of protagonist was not an uncommon stance, to the extent that some early critics avoided mention of John completely. It is true that there is little to be admired in him, and yet it is also difficult to dislike him strongly, except in the moment where he orders the death of Arthur. But even here, his determination doesn't last, and he reveals himself as a pretty feeble character. You can imagine Richard III sneering in the wings at his lack of commitment to what he would have seen as a completely necessary action. Even John's death can only evoke pity at most. As the 19th century actor, publisher and critic William Oxbury put it, "The cold, weak, suspicious John lives without our pleasure and dies without our regret." But I'm not sure that this makes John a failure as a dramatic character. Perhaps what we're meant to see is a curve of decline, and to view it in the light of the opposing upward curve of Philip the Bastard. And there is a moral tone to this. Initially, John can be seen as a competent ruler, and admittedly no better than that. But after he shores up his position by enacting a criminal and morally reprehensible deed, then his downward curve is inevitable. Without a strong character in John, commentators have searched for another, and found Falconbridge, Philip the Bastard, illegitimate son of Richard I. He offers not only the contrast to John, but is a character through which Shakespeare can express patriotism and the strength of England. It is true that he is given some of the best lines of the play, and some would contend that he has the only memorable lines of the play, and is a more central character to the themes of the play than John is himself. In a tale where none of the noble characters behave in particularly noble or heroic ways, that role falls to the illegitimate son of Richard I, who, although he is dead before the opening of the play, his presence nevertheless hangs over it as a remembrance of better, more heroic times in direct comparison to the type of rule that John, Philip and Louis are engaged in, filled with duplicity, scheming and treachery. Against that background, the irony is that Philip the Bastard, who many see as a very complex character, stands out as loyal to his king even though his morality is stretched to the limit by the king's behaviour. John's treatment of Arthur and his willingness to cede the kingdom to the Pope and, to a degree, to the French, rile Philip, who is heroic in the traditional sense, fighting bravely in all of the battles and proving cannier in negotiations than anyone except perhaps Eleanor. Through his asides to the audience, he provides an ironic commentary on events that show that however illegitimate he is the true son of a true king. As a whole, in the play, Shakespeare seems quite concerned with ideas about identity and the mutability of the idea of the self. Philip the Bastard's identity change from illegitimate noble to recognised son of a king is only part of his journey through the play. Because that is dealt with early on, it is easy to forget that he starts out as a semi-legitimate minor noble embroiled in a dispute about the inheritance of lands, to becoming, in effect, the voice of the country. His success on the battlefield is later mirrored by his loss of men on the treacherous Goodwin Sands, those famously ever-changing sandbanks in the English Channel, which in turn also impacts Louis's campaign for England as he too loses men and supplies to the sands. A metaphor, perhaps, for the ever-shifting sands of English politics at the time. The reversals played out are not only military ones. There is Blanche, committing herself to France, only to suddenly find her fortunes reversed as the two old enemies declare war again on each other. Her cries at her misfortune are heartfelt. Then Arthur is thought dead while he is alive, and then thought to be alive while he's dead. And as for trying to pin down each of John's many vacillations, well, there are so many that would be a huge task. He has also been called chameleon-like, but perhaps that suggests rather too much intention and strategy in his frequent changes. This is perhaps the only way in which he is in some way comparable to Richard II, as he tends to be reactive to events rather than commanding them, and driven by a particular morality or specific strategic goal for the good of the country. Once again, we have significant female characters. As in Richard II, we see them making cogent arguments in the face of the actions of the men who rule them. Blanche has a powerful speech as she is caught up between England and France on her wedding day. She says, "Upon thy wedding day, against the blood that thou hast married, what, shall our feast be kept with slaughtered men? Shall braying trumpets and loud churlish drums, clamours of hell, be measures to our pomp? O husband, hear me. I, alack, how new is husband in my mouth, even for the name which till this time my tongue did ne'er pronounce. Upon my knee I beg, go not to arms against mine uncle. The sun o'ercast with blood, fair day, adieu. Which is the side I must go withal? I am with both. Each army hath a hand, and in their rage I having hold of both, they swirl asunder and dismember me. Husband, I cannot pray that thou mayst win. Uncle, I needs must pray that thou mayst lose. Father, I may not wish the fortune thine. Grandam, I will not wish thy fortunes thrive. Whoever wins, on that side I shall lose, assured loss before the match be played. There where my fortune lives, there my life dies. Despite this eloquence, Blanche is essentially a symbol of innocence manipulated. From being betrothed to Arthur, she is forced into and complies with the idea of marrying Louis. Like the other subjects of the kingdom, her allegiances are being dictated by the greater power struggles at a personal cost. Queen Eleanor, on the other hand, is shown as very powerful politically. Her support for John is unswerving, but in the main, is she actually controlling him thanks to his weakness of character and protecting him because through him she has power? She is both intelligent and shrewd, with the understanding of how to deal politically with men. It is she, with the bastard, who is credited with continuing the fight against the French, behaving like the good medieval ruler that John is not. The announcement of her death in France towards the end of the play can be seen as marking the final end of John's rule. Without her support, we can imply he doesn't have a hope. Some critics have also found Constance a less effective character, suggesting that her grief becomes a descent into madness, and that her speeches can seem repetitive and tedious. There is something of the trope of the mad woman about her, but surely it is her grief that stands out and is justified. She also acts as a parallel character to Eleanor. In the early part of the play at least, she is as steadfast in her support of her son as Eleanor is of hers, and her expression of the frustration with Philip's change of heart in support of her cause is clearly expressed. She gains our sympathy. What has become known as her grief speech to King Philip and Pandolf is a popular audition piece for actresses. It is one of those set pieces where Shakespeare balances her genuine emotional expression perfectly, so that she doesn't appear to be playing the victim. By this point, her overt action to get Arthur onto the throne, a claim that she believes to be genuine, is crushed, which is something she cannot control because, as a woman, she has no agency without the support of male allies. The kidnapping and death of Arthur is what propels Constance into a deep state of grief. This grief is misinterpreted, criticised and even mocked by people around her. They tell her she holds too heinous a respect of grief, and that she utters madness and not sorrow. The speech that follows is Constance's attempt at pleading absolute sanity. That if these men around her had experienced what she had, they too would be struck with a grief just as profound. Given her situation, this is her last-ditch attempt at persuading others to her cause. She is in a state of genuine grief, but she is also manipulating that to her own ends. It's the last we hear of Constance apart from the report of her death from unspecified causes, so we assume from grief or madness. Facing men who have ridiculed and betrayed her, Constance attempts to find some empathy with them. She's not looking for their pity, but they dismiss her grief as madness, and so in response she asserts her identity at the top of the speech. There is an intimacy, a privacy to the scene, which is mixed with its public nature. Shakespeare's way of disrupting the traditional functions of the court. He frequently used grief-struck women who have begun to disregard custom to do this. Think of Ophelia and Lady Macbeth. It is a type of power. Constance is no longer bound by manners or status, and it is her grief that has released her from these bonds. She will now do whatever is in her power to get her meaning across to these men. Here is just the first part of that speech. Thou art not wholly to belie me so. I am not mad. This hair I tear is mine. My name is Constance. I was Geoffrey's wife. Young Arthur is my son, and he is lost. I am not mad. I would to heaven I were, for then 'tis like I should forget myself. Oh, if I could, what grief I should forget. Preach some philosophy to make me mad, and thou shalt be canonized, Cardinal. For, being not mad, but sensible of grief, my reasonable part produces reason how I may be delivered from these woes, and teaches me to kill or hang myself. If I were mad, I should forget my son, or madly think a babe of clots were he. I am not mad. Too well I feel the different plague of each calamity. During this part of the speech, Constance has started to unbind her hair, which King Philip takes as a sign of growing madness in her. In the last part of the speech before she makes her final exit, she says, "Grief fills the room up of my absent child, lies in his bed, walks up and down with me, puts on his pretty looks, repeats his words, remembers me for all his gracious parts, stuffs out his vacant garments with his form. Then have I reason to be fond of grief? Fare you well. Had you such a loss as I could give better comfort than you do. I will not keep this form upon my head when there is such disorder in my wit. O Lord, my boy, my Arthur, my fair son, my life, my joy, my food, my all the world, my widow comfort, and my sorrow's cure." Certainly, that has to be a high point of the play. A significant shift in the play comes in the second half, when matters become much more personal and private, rather than featuring the great matters of state involved with the movement and engagement of armies and dynastic marriage. When we see John later in the play, it is only in the company of a handful of lords or those engaged with his personal business, most of which is treacherous in one way or another. The role of Hubert is a slightly confused but important one in the play. He starts out as the spokesman for the French town under siege, representative of the inability of the townspeople to choose a side between John and Philip. But then he becomes a trusted fixer for the king, once he has approved of the bastard's suggestion for the royal marriage. One school of thought is that originally these were separate characters, perhaps played by the same actor, but because the text in the first folio was acquired somewhat tortuously, they became conflated as the same role somewhere in an earlier copying process. There certainly is no reason why the part needs to be played as one character. And the play ends with the words of Philip the Bastard, left to stir up the audience in a reminder of their proud heritage and strength, lifting the action from the rather downbeat ending of the death of an ineffective king. The play of King John is no polemic in the way its predecessors were, but the story of how each of the characters picked their way through the political and personal minefields of the time. But of course, that also applies to England itself, so it is fitting that the play ends with Philip's words. "This England never did, nor never shall, lie at the proud foot of a conqueror, but when it first did help to wound itself. Now these princes are come home again, come the three corners of the world in arms, and we shall shock them. Naught shall make us rue if England to itself do rest but true." Fitting indeed, and many may take that as a speech of hope based on England's inherent strength, all very patriotic. But is there still a note of doubt there, a subtler message of uncertainty? The play could have ended with Henry's coronation, signifying hope, unity and continuity, but Shakespeare chooses to end only on the death of the king. On stage, we have the body of a dead, weak king, with powerful nobles surrounding his successor, a boy king. Everyone was well aware of the dangers of a kingdom during a minority rule, and the bastard's last line has an ominous air about it. If England to itself do rest but true. There is no certainty of that. There is no record of a performance of King John until 1737, when it was staged at the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, and it continued to be revived at intervals until the Victorian period, where it was often produced more for the opportunities it offered to display pageantry and attempts at historical accuracy in costuming than for the content of the play. Interest in it declined in the 20th century as the popularity of the Henriade and the tragedies took over, and significant productions can be counted on fingers alone. It remains one of the lesser performed plays today, with recent productions not firing the public imagination enough to bring it back to stand alongside the Henriade. If you're looking for a production to watch, then the BBC 1984 production on DVD with Leonard Rossiter as King John and John Thaw as Hubert is a pretty good offering. But there is one particular production that deserves a mention. Somewhat bizarrely, as it may seem to us, King John was the first Shakespeare play ever to be filmed. This was in 1899. It was filmed on the Embankment in London and performed by the company managed by Hubert Tree, who was about to take the play onto the London stage. The film was, of course, a silent one and presented just 4 extracts from the play. One with John, Hubert and Arthur, one of Constance's grief speeches, and then scenes of King John's illness and death. Part of the King's death scene has survived, as have a few individual frames which were published in the Sketch magazine as part of a review of the stage production. You can even view that footage on YouTube, and I have put a link to that in the show notes for this episode. Or you can find it simply by searching King John silent film. It is a fascinating insight into the acting style of the time. I think that the actors are possibly playing it in an even more exaggerated way than they would have done on stage. They were very new to the idea of being filmed and are perhaps compensating for the lack of sound, but still, it's an interesting little insight into a moment of theatrical history. Next time, I have a guest episode where we will be discussing the role of the working people portrayed in Shakespeare's plays. And then following that, we reach the milestone that is Romeo and Juliet. In the meantime, if you've not done so already, please join the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram or Blue Sky to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the costs of running the podcast, then please head on over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you do have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or through the website where you can leave me a voice message by clicking on the microphone icon, or you can write to me on the contact page. That's all at www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com.